Listening to Bad Dog Agility, bringing you training tips, interviews, and news about the great sport of dog agility.
I'm Jennifer.
I'm Esteban.
And I'm Sarah, and this is episode 269. Today's podcast is brought to you by hititboard.com. Hititboard.com has the innovative training tools you need for agility. Having problems with the dog walker A-frame? The Hititboard can fix that. Your dog doesn't like tugging? They'll love the Tug It. Can't move your A-frame around by yourself? The Move It can. Go to hititboard.com and use discount code BDA10 to get 10% off your order. That's hititboard.com.
Today we're going to be talking about frustration barking and agility. And the starting point is going to be the dog that is doing great in all their training and foundation work and introduction to obstacles. And now you start sequencing, you get out there, and suddenly the dog really turns on. There's clearly an enthusiasm and love for doing agility. And suddenly a dog that maybe has never done this to you before or did it very rarely will be frustrated. Perhaps a mistake is made. Perhaps you want them to redo an obstacle or have them do it differently. Perhaps they drop the bar. And instead of maybe patiently waiting or getting set up for a second attempt, they suddenly turn on you and bark at you very clearly. It's like they're yelling at you, right? Some dogs, it looks like they're screaming at their handler. Some dogs also get nippy. They might bite or mouth at the handler. These are dogs you typically see jump up, right? They might nip at your arms, especially after a mistake has been made on course. And so you can see a constellation of symptoms of things that are happening with this kind of dog and this kind of relationship with this kind of handler. And so I want to talk about that because we see a lot of it. Certainly we see it amongst our VIP members, and we get lots of questions about this. And we have plenty of experience with dogs like that. Both you and I, Sarah, and Jennifer, who's joining us from Ohio.
Yep, I'm here.
And let me start with Jennifer. So what are the thoughts that you have when I describe this kind of dog to you? What do you think?
Well, upon looking at the title, frustration barking, I think a lot of people immediately are going to turn to me because I have Shelties, and I feel like that is kind of just code for saying barking dog.
I would never.
Barking dog, Sheltie. Odd that it starts with but people looking like, oh, you deal with barking all the time. You have Shelties. But, when we're talking about barking, we're talking about different types of barking. There certainly is barking that is just being happy and vocal, right? That's not what we're referring to in that podcast. But, when barking, as long as the dog is doing their job, I don't have a problem if you bark or you make a lot of squealing noises. Shelties will do it very commonly. Pink is, for those that have seen her run, she kind of makes noise and screams all the way around. We're not talking about that. We're talking about true frustration, barking as a way of communicating with us a frustration, right? Demanding something from us, whether it be, lack of information or, lack of clarity. And, that's not as common in Shelties of kind of, like you said, they turn on you and looking at you and kind of jumping at you. I think we see it a lot more in other breeds, but certainly any breed, any dog is capable of communicating with you the lack of clarity. Some dogs will run off and sniff and you'll have a disconnect that way. But I think the dogs that turn and bark at you, it can sometimes be a bit more obvious because their way of feeling frustrated involves you. It's barking at you versus a dog who turns away and moves away to go, sniff or shuts down in that manner. So, what we're really talking about is looking for the very, very early cues that the dog is not getting the information they need, whether it be handling or dog training, and starting to be smart about looking for those cues, seeing those cues, and then trying to prevent those situations and prevent those scenarios.
That's beautifully put. And I think if we take a step back and we think, okay, give me the bullet points, give me the step-by-steps. What are the things that I need to be thinking about, especially if you're a handler, maybe you've had a couple of agility dogs, maybe this is your first agility dog, and now you've got this dog and you've never really seen it before, right? You've seen your friends have it, but you never really paid attention to what was working and what really wasn't working for them. And I think there's a couple of steps that we need to take, and we're going to explore each of these. And what Jennifer was just talking about was identifying triggers. So one thing that could definitely be happening is your dog is becoming over aroused. Now, this is not a podcast about over arousal per se. We've had podcasts about over arousal. We've had special guests on to talk about it, including Sarah Stremming of the Cognitive Canine. And what Sarah is going to do is link to those episodes in the show notes page. So you should go back, listen to them, see if that's your dog, get the ideas and helpful tips that we talked about in those specific episodes. But it may be that your dog was doing very well, and so now they are being presented with more difficult challenges, right? It's easy, relatively speaking, to teach a dog to wrap or take a single jump. It becomes more difficult when you add 2 and then 3 and then 4. And now you're adding front crosses, rear crosses, wraps, backsides, et cetera, et cetera. The potential for mistakes goes way up, right? It's the difference between multiplying 5 and 5 and 254 and 112. There's more potential for error. The dog is going to make mistakes. And then in your mind, you're thinking, hey, we've never run into this problem before. Well, actually, you've just never pushed the dog or taught at a level or required the kind of work where the dog is more likely to make mistakes, right? You've been doing all the easy, fun stuff. Now you're getting into it. Now you're starting the sequencing. Now mistakes are being made, right? And so I think that's important to realize, that this may not be a change in the dog per se, because a lot of what people are going to tell you is my dog suddenly turned on and became very different. The clues were probably there all along, maybe even from puppyhood. You know, we've got some young dogs ourselves. My current golden retriever is like this. And I feel comfortable saying that because, you know, I'm an observer of our dogs. And I feel like she's very much like Gitchy's mother, Gree, who's a dog who could really lay into you with the barking and the frustration on mistakes. She wanted to go fast. She wanted to get everywhere quickly. And she did not tolerate mistakes very well. And having worked with several dogs like that, it was easy for me to see this in this dog, even when she was very young, just several months old, and confirmed to me by other littermate owners, right? And they say, hey, you know, watch out for the barking. I say, hey, you know, way ahead of you. Yeah, I noticed that. I noticed that as well. And so I think kind of understanding right there is very helpful, that maybe this is not some new problem that you created. Maybe this is kind of in the personality of the dog and it's kind of been there all this time, and just the situation is kind of uncovering it. And so the next part of that is I get support from the litter mates. You're getting support from us. So it turns out lots of people have this problem. Lots of dogs are like this, right? And if you go to your next trial, you can probably pick out a couple of dogs who are probably dealing with this kind of stuff, right? And so don't feel bad about it. Very common problem. It's not necessarily some monster you created. A lot of people feel that way. I've created a monster. I've done this. I've done that. Agility has turned them into this. So, you know, you can get away with some of that. So I like that about finding the triggers. And Jennifer talked about basically modifying the environment, right? So Jennifer, people, they have a lot of success in their introductory class. Then they get out in their first sequencing class at your facility. They're excited. They finally get a class and it's with the Jennifer Crank. And they know they've got a great dog and everybody tells them they have a great dog and everybody's excited about the drive that their dog has. And this is the fastest, best dog they've ever had. And then they make a mistake. They knock a bar and you're going to redo it. And then suddenly this dog just turns and starts barking. And then they feel, you know, really bad about themselves. What are you telling them about basically the class environment and expectations there?
Yeah, I think keeping an eye on the environment that the dog is put in is super key in identifying frustration and potentially preventing it. So in a perfect world, we would have, you know, a 12 by 12 ring and there would only be one jump. And then we'd go to a bigger ring and there'd be 2 and then 3 and we'd build as the dog is appropriate. But this is real life. And we know that sometimes, you know, at a lot of facilities, they might have a puppy class or a beginner class that's like on mats in a smaller area with a tunnel and a contact trainer. And then all of a sudden their next class is in a 100 by 100 space, wide open, lots of equipment, all this running. And the dog is instantly, you know, going from the playground down the street where there's 3 swings and a slide to the middle of Disney World. And it's like, whoa, like, where do I even start? Which part of the park do I go to first? How are we going to get this all in one day? So, you know, in a perfect world, we build up to that. And I think when you have a dog that is dealing with, you know, kind of maybe so much over the top, the handler's struggling to deal with that frustration, because as you said, it's not teaching the obstacles, it's running and building, is really monitor the environment. Maybe instead of a class where there's 6 dogs and you're with really high drive dogs or you're with other barky dogs, maybe you need to start with a private lesson, right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you would say, okay, you're ready to go to a competition class. Let's do some privates with competition level content. Make sure we can handle that, then put you in the class. Or maybe check with the instructor as to who's in the class, and not because we're testing people's personalities and who's going to judge you, but maybe a really over the top dog would be good in a class with milder dogs that are less exciting and less stimulating. Although in some cases, finding dogs that are like yours in a class can be a good thing because everybody's in the same boat and they're going to tolerate and understand when you need to stop and take breaks or have a shorter session. Same thing with kind of the length of the sequences. I know that's maybe not directly environmental, but sometimes you'll go from, all the equipment. All right, let's run this 6 obstacle sequence. And it's like, well, what happened to 2 and 3 and 4? So I think from an environmental perspective, definitely working with a smaller area and building as much as possible, building up to a larger space, but also group versus private lessons. And even within a group where there's going to be multiple dogs on the floor versus a group where it's only 1 dog at a time. Because we have a mix of both. We have some classes where I can take a group of 6 people and I can say, all right, everybody, I want you to go to a jump and I want you to warm up your forward sends. And for some dogs, that's going to be too much, right? It's going to put them over the top and it's going to frustrate them. So doing some classes where you don't have them. So it's looking for those little things that are keying the dogs up. Sometimes that frustration isn't in something that you did, but it could even be the frustration of they can't get out there and run with the other dogs. So that when you go out on the course, they carry it over to you with barking. So there's definitely some factors to test for, and private lessons, I think, can be an option for those dogs that need shorter sessions as well. We didn't talk about time, but that would kind of be almost in my mind an environmental thing. You take an hour class, don't feel like you need to do the hour. Watch your dog. If at 40 minutes, your dog's, don't go to 41, right? Know what your dog's threshold is and build and build and build up to that. Maybe you need 5 minutes and then take a break and 5 minutes and then take a break. So, kind of keeping an eye on the length of the training session and at what time do you feel they go over the top, and then don't let yourself get to that time.
Okay. We talked about environment. We talked about triggers. We talked about classes. We talked about making things easier and identifying those triggers. What do we actually do in the moment? And I think there's 2 strategies. They're basically the opposite sides of a single coin. You should be doing both of these things. Okay. Number 1, people mess this up all the time, is do not reinforce the behavior. Okay. There are people who are literally teaching their dog to do this without thinking they are. They think they're shutting it down, but they are actually reinforcing the behavior. We'll get into some examples. The other side of that is ask for a different behavior, cue a different behavior, right? So for those of us, I'm not going to look at any Sheltie owners that may or may not be on my screen. If you have a dog that barks all the time, if you ask the dog to do something else that they can't bark during that time, like, I don't know, drink water or something, right? It's hard for a dog to bark and drink water at the same time. They can only do one or the other, right? So some kind of incompatible behavior, right? And so if you have a dog that's jumping up, barking and biting at your arm, if you cue them to say, roll over 2 or 3 times in a row, right? They're not going to be biting your arm. It's an incompatible behavior, right? So I don't want to reinforce what they're doing. That's bad, right? I don't want that. I want that behavior to be extinguished. I want it to go away. And I want to replace it with things that I want them to do or that are okay in that context. Preferably things that are legal in an agility ring, competition ring. That would be great, right? And so I think that's what you need to do in the moment. And so now we can start getting into the details, and I will throw this open question to both Sarah and Jennifer here. What do you think are ways that people are inadvertently reinforcing this behavior? Don't tell me I've stumped you guys. Right. So I think, okay, so I suppose I'll get into it. Do you have students that, this is for both of you, when their dog gets really amped up, that the owner yells back at them and then goes ahead and does what the dog wants them to do, which is generally to reattempt the agility, right? They'll be like, all right, calm down, hold your horses. We're going back to the starting line. Okay, come here. Okay, sit. Okay, ready? Here we go. Here we go. Okay, I'm going. Fine. Do you see? I'm going. Right? Like literally you've seen this. So I think that people literally, instead of ignoring the behavior, kind of feed into it. They kind of have a conversation with their dog. But ultimately, because the dog is getting back to what they want, because there never is any action like to do some alternative behavior, they end up reinforcing that behavior. So the dog understands that this is how life works. Okay. I drop a bar. I don't get my reinforcement. I bark at my handler and say, hey, where is my reinforcement? Or you're not going to give it to me. Well, you're going to give me another chance. Okay. I'm getting my other chance. Okay. Here we're going. And then ultimately they get their reinforcement.
I think of those type of reactions by the handler a lot of times. I think of them as like performative. There's something that the handler does to fill the space because there's other people around and there's other people watching and they don't quite know what else to do about it. Mm-hmm. Maybe at home, they're more corrective, but they don't feel comfortable doing that in front of people. And so then they default into this like talking display that's really meant for everybody who's watching and not necessarily for their dog, to try to get through that moment. Mm-hmm. And so, it's not helpful. And then the flip side is if your normal go-to is more corrective, that's also not helpful. So we want to replace that with something that is helpful.
Right. There you're trying not to reinforce it, but people can become very confrontational with their dog. The worst thing I ever saw was like a small dog owner. I think the dog like blew off a contact or something. And then when the lady tried to set the dog up again, the dog became like a little like, don't get near me, like growling. And the instructor's like, put your hands on the dog and you show him who's boss. I was like, nah, like, don't do that. And then sure enough, like, the dog tried to bite the lady. You don't want to meet that kind of aggression with aggression. And that's like that's different because that's aggression as opposed to frustration. I'm not saying that frustration can't lead to aggression, but I think that's a very different problem than what we're talking about here. So we want to put that on the side and come back to the frustration side. I think the other thing that people do to reinforce it is to basically ignore it. So on course, what does that look like? The dog misses a contact and you go on, and now the dog's more likely to miss contact in the future, right? So same thing here. The dog makes a mistake, you make a mistake, whatever, something's gone wrong. They're frustration barking at you, right? And instead of not reinforcing it, you just pretend like it's not even happening. The dog is screaming at you the whole time. They're biting up. I've seen people like, they're just hiding their arms. They're trying to like not get bit, and they go back to the starting line and then they just go and run the sequence again.
Well, I think you just made a really key point, right? Is they think that they're not reinforcing it when they're ignoring it. But the way they're ignoring it is actually reinforcing it because they're giving the dog what they want, which is go back and try it again. Get back to agility.
Right.
Right. And so there is a very, very fine line between waiting for a moment when the dog is not doing the bad thing versus tolerating the barking while you take them back to the start to do the entire sequence again, in which case you are doing what the dog wants.
Well, now you've gotten into the very specific solution. And so this is my number one favorite solution that I think everybody can try with their dog. So at some point, no matter how bad the dog is, and we have worked with the absolute worst dogs ever with this kind of frustration barking, and not just our own, but clients. There's going to be a time they have to take a breath. There's going to be a time they stop. There's going to be a time they stop jumping, if just for a moment, in order to recover, in order to do it some more. Okay. And in that moment, you can slip in the marker, right? Which is going to be a click or a yes, in my case, verbal yes. And then you're going to reward. And if they're barking and biting at you while they take the reward, that's fine. The marker is already there. And they are going to discover very quickly what the marker is for. So I had this golden, right? I opened the gate and she would be bouncing up, right? And barking. And so eventually it became just bouncing up, and then it became just lifting the front legs up. And then it became her 4 feet never leave the grass, right? That was over a course of several months, and just getting out there and constantly never initiating the game, which means I never threw the toy. The toy is on me. She never got to tug. She never got a mark until all 4 feet were on the floor and she wasn't barking. And so now that is the offered behavior. She knows. She just goes right through the gate, flips around, and just looks at me. 4 feet on the ground, looking at me, no barking, right? And she's always going to get the yes, and then I throw the toy, or yes, and then I present the tug.
Well, and it's like mother may I, right?
Yes.
Where people are, where somebody is like creeping up and they can only walk until the person turns around, right? That's what's happening with you and your dog when you do it.
Right.
If she starts barking, it's not just that you don't give her the toy. You stop walking, right? If you're about to walk up to the start line, you just freeze.
Right. It's not happening. So it's tough for people in class. Like it's easy for me in my backyard, right? So I'm telling you, oh, well, that behavior is great. You want that behavior. And all of you are like, oh yeah, I need that behavior. But the dog won't shut up for a minute. You can find that 1 second. And literally that's how you have to start. And I just had to wait this dog out. And even if you're catching them in between jumps, at some point they start to experiment. They're like, wait, is it me jumping half up that's kind of doing it? Is it me like barking more shrilly? Is it me not barking? Like they're going to experiment. And then now you're in the game. You're in the training game. You're shaping them and you're working out a puzzle together, right? You guys are communicating, right? And that's what we're going for here. Okay. So I'm not going to go out there and train with the dog if they are in this state, right? And I make them prove to me that they're not in that state right away at the gate when I first open it. Okay. But now let's say you're in a class, you do it, you got the dog leashed up, you walk in there, the dog seems to be okay. You unleash, everything's going great. You do the first sequence, it's fine. You do the second sequence, there's a mistake, and now your dog goes off. Okay. It doesn't matter. That for you is your gate moment, the same gate moment that I had with my dog. You're just going to sit there and you're going to wait. And when you find something that you can reinforce, something that you can click for, something that you can say yes, then you build from there and see if you can get it again and get it again. But if, let's say they're quiet for a moment, I click and I treat them and then I start to line them up and then they get triggered again. Am I going to run the sequence? No, I'm going to go right back in. I'm just going to stop. I'm going to look at them and I'm just going to see what they do. Right. And then when they offer the thing again, yes, treat. Yes, treat. Okay. Line up, sit here again. Oh, you're barking at me again? Okay. Well, we're not going. So I'm not going to ask you to sit. We're going to wait for you again. Okay. And I will play this game all day long with you. Oh, our turn is up. Oh, it's up. We didn't get to do one more sequence. Do you know what I mean? That's the sacrifice that you have to make in the short term over several sessions. For me with this golden, it was over several months, but it works. For people who have dogs that they enter the field and the dog is bouncing up at them, that's been taught. That's been reinforced. Maybe not deliberately by the instructor, but I assure you that is a learned behavior.
Basically, the handler has decided that doing the sequence or getting in the work that they plan to get in is more important than dealing with that behavior, right? And so then over time, the dog figures that out. The dog figures out that you're not willing to sacrifice that. I think that what would be helpful is to, I think the number one mistake that people make in this process, I think a lot of people, they understand what you're saying, but they don't see those moments that they can reinforce, and they don't do it fast enough. I think a lot of people ask for too much. They have this dog that is just barking and jumping and jumping and bouncing and bouncing and bouncing, and they want to wait until the dog is 100% under control, like black and white, right? There's a lot of times when black and white is good, but when you're trying to, shape a behavior essentially, right? Black and white is not your friend. You want the tiniest moment of acceptability, especially when you have a behavior that's been going on a while. The tiniest moment of acceptable behavior.
Well, let me be very specific then, because the behavior we're talking about is the biting and nipping at you kind of behavior, biting at your clothes, biting at your arm. Usually the thing that goes first is they get tired of jumping. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I will click even if they are actively barking at me.
If they had previously been bouncing at you.
Yeah. Right. So the dog is jumping up on you, or they got their paws on your chest and they're bark, right? Or they're grabbing at the toy and snapping at you and barking, right? I don't continue to try and hide the toy. I just kind of go dead. I go very still, right? And the dog, they may continue to bark, but they will get 4 feet on the ground. Boom, that's a click. Click and a treat. And they're like, whoa, what just happened? Or for their toy, they're keen for the toy, right? It's a click and then I throw the toy, or a click and then I present the tug, and they're like, what just happened here? Right? And then eventually what happens is at some point in anticipation of eating a treat or biting onto the toy, they stop barking. So they give you that. So a lot of people, just like you said, I think that's a very good point. I wasn't even detailed enough for people who are like this. Go first for the physical body, because you can click and shape that easier. And then barking kind of goes away as they prepare their mouths for more useful things. Okay. And then you can start clicking that and then add that criteria in. But usually I'm going to go for body control first, which is stop biting, mauling, trying to take the toy, nipping at my underarm, tricep, clothing, etc.
Right.
Yeah.
And for the dogs that are out in the field, right? Let's give some concrete ideas of that first moment that you can click. That, when you have essentially lost their focus or they won't come into you. They don't want you to grab their collar, things like that, where there's that kind of frustration barking, a little bit more standoffish. And I think there, I would say your go-to is eye contact.
Yeah,
because it can happen. Because it can happen at a distance.
Right.
So it's not that you're waiting for your dog to come all the way to you or anything like that. You get that moment of eye contact, and that's what you're going to mark and reward.
Yeah, and observers aren't going to really understand, right? All they're going to see is this dog jumping up, nipping at you, biting at you, trying to get the toy and barking, and then they are still barking at you, and then you click and you give them the toy. They don't realize that you've clicked and reinforced for them not mauling you or having forepaws on the ground. And as you said, when they become hand shy. So the golden, I assume you mentioned this because the golden gets hand shy, right? And so border collies are very hand shy as well, right? So if something's going on and you try to put your hand on a collar, they are going to instinctively, through generations of breeding, back away from you, especially if you move at them quite suddenly. So one of the things we do from puppyhood is get our dogs used to us grabbing at their collars for a wide variety of reasons, right? Whether it's a car coming, they're going to cross the street, whatever, kids on the way. We want to be able to grab our dogs by the collar and not have them freak out. And so I'm going to do collar conditioning work. And in that moment, I will start it from ground zero right there with the golden, right? So first she gets clicked for not barking or not jumping, and then for not barking. And then I'm going to raise my hand and then click.
And not even move it towards her.
I don't even move it towards her. And then I will raise my hand and touch her head, and she gets a click, especially if she doesn't back away, right? And so on and so forth until I'm touching her collar. So we've completely changed the game. We were here to do agility. We were here to practice some wraps. Right now I'm teaching the dog how to do some wraps and jump like on 8-inch jumps. And we're trying to increase distance. So as I step away and the wraps get farther and farther, at some point she's going to fail. And when she fails, I try and set up for the next wrap. And she's like, screw that. I'm angry. I'm frustrated. You're making this harder. This is a bogus deal. And then she's going to start her frustration barking and jumping up and all that stuff.
And it's almost like a double whammy from the dog's point of view, right? They made the mistake, which they recognize, and then they don't get the reward because they made the mistake.
Yeah.
Which really makes her mad.
Yeah. So, from the dog's perspective, this is just conversation. And and so then we end up playing the collar game. That may end the session there. Or if I feel like she's sufficiently back, now I'll take a couple steps in to make sure we have success, right? This is doing what Jennifer is telling you to do. Modify the environment. We're going to make things easier for the dog. I'm bringing her in 2 to 3 feet closer where I knew she definitely had success last time. She's going to do it, get rewarded. And what has she learned from all of this, right? She learned that barking and jumping and doing all that nonsense got her nothing, right? Kept her away from the agility, delayed her from reinforcement, and that there's a better way to get what she wants, right? And this ultimately is what your dog needs to learn. It's going to pop out. Like I said, I've been doing all this work with the golden, but I'm sure there are going to be times where she's amped up or she's going to look out there. And again, Jennifer talked about this. What if there's 5 dogs visiting our yard out in the field and she comes through that gate? Maybe she's going to quote unquote revert back to her old behaviors, right? But that's just the stakes have been upped in the environment. And so then you have to proof against that. You got to work on that. But that's how you do it. So this should be a very clear blueprint for you, for everyone listening. Okay. So you're going to modify the environment, identify all the triggers. Those go hand in hand. You're going to make sure you're not reinforcing the behavior, ignoring it in a very bad way, as Sarah pointed out, or egging the dog on or matching frustration with your own frustration. We don't want any of that. And we want to provide alternative behaviors. We like to go for eye contact, but an alternative behavior to jumping all over you is what? 4 paws on the ground. Only needs to be for a moment. Click it or say yes, reinforce yes with the toy that they so desperately are mauling you for. That's what they want. So you can give it to them. They just had to do something to earn it. So you need to get that alternative behavior there. And I think that covers, I think broadly everything there, right? So I'm looking at comments that we had received about it. Yeah. And so I think other strategies, you want to go back to the other podcasts, like how you deal with over-arousal. Jennifer had, what were some of the things that you were doing where you felt like maybe Swift specifically was like very amped up or could get amped up? Like what were some strategies that you were using like before runs or after runs where you thought you saw some improvement? So these are kind of more general strategies that are away from in the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked, and I'm a huge fan, decompression walks. I've had many conversations about them, really trying to focus on getting him in that right headspace. In the training sessions, I try to very much, and you already talked on this, Esmond, but kind of create a training loop. So, I'm training weave poles or teaching 2x2s. I don't just mark and reward and then randomly let the dog trot their way back to me, and then have a failure and circle around. It's, we do weave poles, come into the side, do the cookie setup again. I had a lot of issues with my running dog walk with Swift specifically when I wasn't creating an appropriate training loop. And Abby, my training partner, Abby Beasley, got on me. She was watching me train and I was like, he's barking at me. He's frustrated. And I was getting frustrated. She's like, create the loop, create the loop. She's like, he runs the mat, he goes to the manners minder, he comes to you, he gets a cookie, he runs the mat, he goes to the manners minder, he gets a cookie, he comes, and as soon as I did, he's like, okay, cool, this is a good plan. I got this. And I got rid of all the barking. I think in terms of progressions, a lot of times people want to go, 1, 2, 3, 4, right up the levels, which can easily be putting that dog closer and closer and closer to failure. So one of the things I like to do is be very kind of sporadic in the way I get up. So it might be like a 1, 2, 1, 3, 2, 3, 1, 4. Like let him have success. Okay, a little harder. All right, back to another success. Okay, just a little bit harder. All right, let's get a couple good ones. I think people want to climb straight up, and they're just slowly climbing up that threshold. So I might do a forward send from 4 feet away, do a forward send from 5 feet away. Okay, I'm going to go back to 4 feet. Okay, now let's try 6. So that the dog's coming right off of that success. So lots of things. And I think building on what you guys were saying with the barking goes full circle back to what I was saying about the environment, which is all those tidbits you mentioned, super great, except people don't want to take the time to do it in a class because the instructor needs to speak. And how does the instructor speak? In a quiet room. And so if a dog is barking, the person, I see this every day I'm at the building, shoves food in their dog's face so that the instructor can talk. Or the people are annoyed by the barking. So the dog, is barking out of frustration rather than being patient and waiting for that moment. If I need to say something, or they'll look at me and say, what did I do wrong? Well, if their dog's barking, I won't talk, because I'm not going to scream and lose my voice over it. So I would be fine as instructor for them to wait it out, but they just want that immediate reply. So they start giving the dog cookie and going, wait, what'd you say I need to do? And boom, right there, that dog's getting reinforced. The number of Shelties that have trained their handlers to feed them because that's how they get them quiet. It's like, it's this vicious cycle. And so that's where, again, maybe the private lessons where you can be patient and not feel the pressure of needing to get that dog quiet quickly because of the others that are around.
Yeah, such a great point. We've given you the tools. You know exactly what you need to do. You know exactly what we're doing for our own high drive dogs who've shown and exhibited these frustration behaviors. So now it's a matter of you incorporating it into your training, being prepared for it every single session at every moment, because there's sometimes I just get blindsided. I'm like, oh, she hasn't done this in weeks or months. And then she does it. I'm like, wait, what do I do? What am I? Oh yeah. Okay. I kind of wait for her to calm down just for a second here. And also not try and finish the session, whatever I'm working on, like deal with this now this is where the dog's at. So yeah, I think that's pretty helpful. All right. I think that does it for this week.
That's right. We'd like to thank our sponsor, hitupboard.com. Happy training.